I actually was born and grew up in Western Sydney, in Villawood. I was very familiar with the local migrant hostel, so I had a very broad range of friends from different backgrounds. And when I was a teenager, I think I was about 13, my folks decided that they were going to move to Melbourne, and so we moved there. I went to high school in Victoria. It wasn't such a happy time. It was such a transition from early teenage years going from Sydney to Melbourne at that age. So I completed high school, completed year 10, and then basically had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. But one of the things that I've clung to all of my life was when I was very little, we grew up, as I said, we grew up in Western Sydney. Both of my grandfathers were in the military, and one in particular, Poppy Hogg, he had always used to tell us stories about his time in the army. He was in Burma. He was in the British Army, but he was in Burma, so he served alongside the Gurkhas. So he had a lot of military equipment, that he was allowed to bring out when he emigrated. So I was very familiar with the kukri and all the medals that go with the Second World War campaign. But he also had the most fabulous greatcoat that I used to sleep under when I was a little kid. And I remember that the smell of that coat, the brass buttons, everything about it. So I had some quite romantic ideas about being in the military. He also was in possession of the most fantastic medals that you could imagine. So being a small child, all these shiny things that Pop used to bring out at Anzac Day. And there were a couple of medals in particular that really stood out for me that I learnt about later, which was Boer War and South Africa medals. One of them had 4 bars and the other one had 2. And then there were other World War I campaign medals. So that was going back, that would have been I think it was his uncle that served in those campaigns. So from that really piqued my interest, I think, in the military. And he used to have the most fantastic stories about his time in India in the various forts. So that, I think, was where the seed was planted. So when I discovered, after I finished high school, that I really had no idea what I wanted to do, and at that point there was a lot of unemployment, and I guess I kind of defaulted back to thinking about going to the military. And it really started from there. It took a long time to get in. I think it took me 3 years of applying. And I was eventually accepted in 1979. And I was given basically 24 hours notice from the time I got, they tracked me down and I got the phone call, to actually being at the barracks or at the recruitment centre in Sydney before going to the RAC school at Georges Heights. So I had to pack up my life in 24 hours, it was so exciting, and I had no idea what to expect. So that's really my story, I guess, at the start of my military career. I left school in 1975. I actually just floated around. I was quite, I guess, not itinerant, but just unsettled, had no idea what I was really looking for in life. And the employment situation in New South Wales and Victoria at that time were pretty dire, probably Australia-wide. So options were very limited for someone who'd only gone to year 10 and then only just really scraped through. So the army was, I guess, a good option for me. It gave me structure. And that's what I was looking for. I was looking for structure and I was looking for discipline. And recruit training gave that to me in spades. There was lots of PT, which was fine because I was always a sporty kid. So lots of PT, things like bushcraft, learning how to pack a pack properly so that you're not going to tear your shoulders apart with the weight and things like that. Learning how to march, which is funny because I kind of already had an idea because, playing, I was one of 4 children and, Pop used to play soldiers and make us, play like soldiers and whatnot in the backyard, had us marching around. So it was kind of, it felt very, very familiar, but at the same time some of the things were very, very different in particularly living that communal living. We lived in quite rudimentary barrack blocks in Georges Heights, which is in a lovely part of Sydney. But it was strange being sort of shut away from the rest of the world for that period of time. But until we were allowed, I can't remember how long it was, but we were eventually allowed to go out and rejoin society for a little while before we all had to come back in. So that was recruit training. We were asked to put down some ideas about where we wanted to go. So I wanted to do something a bit exciting, but then quickly realised that at that point in '79, women weren't really employed in any of the arms. So, and the army, I guess, at that stage was transitioning about how it was going to integrate women into the broader defence force. And so we did lots of, I guess, things that perhaps earlier recruits hadn't done. Probably more so a little bit later on when I went to officer school. But basically, being told I was going to be an administration clerk was not so thrilling. So the minute I went from Mossman from Georges Heights to my initial employment training, which was at Bandiana in Victoria, on the border of New South Wales and Victoria, went there. I started my clerical course, and then it was such a big school that we ended up meeting a lot of people from other walks of life, and that were going to be doing other things within the army. And one of them was parachute training, or parachute rigging to be exact, so packing parachutes. So I thought that sounds a bit more exciting and up my alley. So while I was at initial employment training, I actually applied to do a parachute course. So that meant doing an actual jumps course, which I did. But in the meantime, that all sort of takes a few months. So my first posting was actually here to Canberra to a psychological research unit. And that was doing data entry. I was a key punch operator or something like that, and registering mail.
So for people that don't know what a key punch operator is,
it's this clunky old machine that you used to, it was like cards. All I can remember, it was like this card. This is pre-computer days. So it was just like a card that had a series of, I think, numbers or squares on it, and you just input that into this machine. It was not glamorous. It was just, I thought, this is really not what I saw myself doing. So after a short time, when the parachute course came up, I jumped at it. They said yes, I could go. So I went and did my parachute training course, and the jump after my my qualifying jump, so that I'd get my wings, my parachute wings, I broke my leg. So that was, and that still has long-term effects on me now. But anyway, so I then realised that I would never be able to be a parachute rigger because I wasn't able to. I was told I couldn't keep jumping parachuting anymore. So that meant I had to change direction. I decided that I was going to apply for officer training. And because I'd left school, high school, quite young, well, sorry, not so much so young, but so in year 10 I didn't go through to matriculate. I discovered that I didn't have the education that was required, so the Army put me through a 6-month education course, and I came out with basically HSC, I think you'd call it now, HSC. And from there, I met the education requirement to do the officer training. So I did. In 1982, I did the officer training course for 12 months, once again back at RAC School in Georges Heights, back in the same old blocks that we were recruits in. And from there, I still have friends from that period that when you live with someone in such close quarters, they're lifelong friendships. And I still keep in touch with a number of those girls these days. So it was a fabulous time, not without its challenges. We did once again a lot of physical training. We did a lot of work running with a heavy pack, in full, boots, greens, a simulated rifle or weight that you would consider would be the weight of a rifle. So we used to run through the streets of Mossman in formed ranks, and then so that was really when they were looking. I guess the Army was looking at how are we going to move from being a women's training establishment to integrating the women into with the males at RMC, Royal Military College. So we also started doing a little bit of weapons training then. So we would go on the range, for example, the rifle range, and we would fire a number of weapons, like a submachine gun, a 9mm pistol, 7.62 SLR, which was quite a big rifle, very big. All of those, the submachine gun and the pistol were fine for me, but being quite short, the handling such a large rifle as a SLR really presented challenges for me. But yeah, I really enjoyed being on the range. We also did a lot of tactical exercises, going out bush again, as we used to call it, doing navigational exercises and training for quite a lengthy period of time. But you could see it was all looking. You could see it was just how are we going to move this? What the Army was going to do with us? How we were going to move and transition. So there was 1 year after mine that did officer cadet training, women's officer cadet training at Georges Heights, and then the following year, so from 1984, I believe, was the first integrated course. So it was it was peacetime, so there was not a lot of military operations going on at the time. One of the things that had a lasting effect on me, though, was the Falklands War. When I was doing my officer training, the Falklands War was on at the time, and that really, I guess, gave me an understanding of, well, you know what, this is not just about running around the bush, playing soldiers or whatever, with no disrespect, but this is serious. So that was really something that I had to process, even though it was a long way away. I didn't think we'd get dragged into the Falklands, but it was just a stark reminder that that's what war was. It was a very different sort of war. There was a little bit of land war, but it was mainly aerial and, the ships. But so that had a lasting impression on me. When I graduated from Officer Cadet School, I graduated into Transport Corps, and that was brilliant because it actually, my first posting was actually to Singleton Transport Unit, and we used to support the infantry centre. So I got to meet a lot of, even as a young officer, I got to meet a lot of Vietnam veterans, infantry veterans, fabulous people that, had the most hair-raising stories about Vietnam. So as a junior officer, it was a fantastic opportunity for me to hear and see how it was for people who actually served in times of conflict. So that was wonderful, and from there I spent a little bit of time in Puckapunyal doing training, doing more transport training, being about how to be a logistics officer. And then after that, I ended up going to Sydney, to Liverpool Transport Unit, and that's where we supported the brigade, one brigade at the time. That was, once again, very logistics focused, moving them out on big exercises up to the northern parts of Australia. That was a fabulous time. It was just all about learning. It was learning you were learning all the time. You still did all of those things that I did in training, like going to the range to requalify for, weapons training, lots of physical training. It felt a bit strange being in a capital city and being a soldier. I was an officer by then, but, just being in that environment, you just think about people in the military being out there. And then shortly after, I got married when I was at Liverpool Transport Unit, and I married a fellow who was actually a warrant officer. So there was a bit of a no-no, a commissioned officer marrying a non-commissioned officer. But we're still together. It's been, he's great. So following that, I then went into the headquarters. I was promoted and went into the headquarters in Victoria Barracks in Sydney. And that's when I saw the other side of being in the forces, where it was really about being in a desk job. And I wasn't so keen on that, but that's what happens.
So what rank were you at that point?
I was a captain then. I was promoted to captain at that point. And organising logistics, but on a much bigger scale. So, looking at plans of the HMAS Tobruk, for example, and doing load plans for that, or parts of load plans for that, and writing movement instructions for the movement of large bodies of troops. So it was very interesting, and once again I had a very experienced senior officers around me who I was learning a lot from. And then I was posted to the Army Maritime School over on Middle Head. So Georges Heights was just above us, so I was very familiar with the area. We were hugely lucky and managed to get a married quarter on Middle Head Road in Mossman, which we were very fortunate to get. And life was fantastic. And I had my first child there, Thomas. And it was it was just a wonderful period of time. My husband was posted to Melbourne, so I followed him to Melbourne, and it was another headquarter job, and I thought, oh, here we go again. And at that point, having a young child who was not the best sleeper, and I was constantly tired and whatever, I just discovered that being a military mum is a little bit difficult, and I think nowadays there were just not the supports in place that you have nowadays. But then how I reflect on that is that I don't think that I had the pressures that modern military mums have now with the places they go, the expectations. So I think it must balance itself out. But it was difficult for me because I was so committed to the Army and I loved the Army, but my family came first. So I had a little bit of a wobble there, I guess, and decided, what am I going to do? And then number 2 comes along, my daughter Susie. And shortly after Susie was born, I thought, no, I'm going to leave the service. With real sadness, because it's such a family. Being in the Army, it was such a family and very supportive. But in those days, there was also the recognition now that like mental health and things like that, it was very difficult to be an officer where you were expected to be on top of your game all the time and not have any wobbles. There were no allowances for that sort of, I guess, those feelings at that time. So, I mean, I probably put more pressure on myself, but I felt like I can't serve 2 things 100%. So, Army will have to go, and I will just focus on the family, which in hindsight now, where I work now, where I'm constantly around, veteran stories and military history and the tales, and it's just, I love it. I feel like I'm gaining something back from what I missed out on. Peacetime was very interesting. So we were sandwiched between Vietnam and Gulf War. And there were a few natural disasters, but I always seemed to be on a training course when there was a natural disaster. So we had the big fires in Victoria in 1983 and I was on training, so I didn't get to, help out with that. And then there was some big floods, I think, in Nyngan, where I was not able to go. So it's interesting how the role of the Defence Forces is changing over time. But I don't regret for 1 minute joining the forces. I am in awe of what people do these days, how they juggle things. It was a different time too with the male-female, how that dynamic was working. I always had a good time with, there was never any tensions around those sorts of things. I did see a little bit of it, but it never impacted me.
Did you see it manifest?
Just being overlooked sometimes for certain. Actually, there is one situation that I remember. I was desperate to be a committee member on the mess in the particular area I was in, and it was traditionally something that went to a man, and it did. So, but that's okay. That's just how it was. It's a different time, and I think it felt very transitory, though. I think it was. I was in the military in a time when we were just working out what we could do with women, or why should women be restricted to this or that, and the policies at the time. I really don't know that. While they'd done a review, etc., about women, I really don't know if there was any huge, not interest, that's not the right word, the take-up of some of the recommendations may not have been carried through. There was the will to do those things. But it happened very quickly. After that, from that point, then it seemed to be very quick. Women are now doing everything, and I think it's fantastic. I love to hear their stories. I think they're incredibly interesting and capable and worthy of praise. I do have a lot of women friends that were from that pre-integration time, and they liked it how it was, not necessarily not doing some of the different roles, but I guess it was just we were our own core. So when I first finished recruit training, I wore a RAC badge on my cap or on my beret. I did not wear my core badge. And it was that sense of being part of something that was very special, and the nurses too, the nursing corps. It was sometimes, it felt great to be that little bit different and special. And then when I finished my officer cadet training, I wore a transport badge. So they'd moved at that point. So, and that to me was highly symbolic of the way the integration was going to go. We were now identified with a corps and not a women's corps. I loved operational roles. I felt I was better at those roles than doing purely administration work. I loved the challenge of leadership, both male and female. I loved, that side of being an officer in particular. I loved the leadership roles that the Army offered me. It taught me how to get people to do unpleasant things, but that had to be done or the task couldn't be completed. And I learnt that it built my confidence in doing that, but it's while you don't have to know every intimate detail, you had to understand what you were asking someone to do. And if you had an understanding of that, you can get soldiers to follow you. And that was a massive revelation, I guess, for me, is that just understanding people's drivers and how to get people to do things that they really don't want to do, but they'll do it because they know that you know what you're asking them to do, and they know that it is imperative to the task that task is completed for the greater benefit So integrity, definitely, and leadership, those things that I was able, to do. And they might have only been little things, but one of my bosses said to me once, she said, I always give you the hard things to do because the troops will do them. And I guess I just had an affinity with people at the time, and I loved what I did. I loved it. And the reason we got married was we realised that they were not going to always post us together. So that was another reason. While they accommodate you as best you can, I mean, that's just how it was. If they couldn't make it work, well, then I realised that there would have been a separation, and that's not what that's not what I wanted. The Army it's a wonderful family, but it has to have limitations on what it can do, what it can provide, by the nature of it. Everyone who serves in the Army or in the military is basically the ultimate public servant. Public service is what it's all about, whether it's in our role as, as part of a peacekeeping force, or whether it's part of a military operation. They put themselves behind their needs, behind the needs of the greater good. And if you understand that, that's why for me the Army was going to be a career for life, not something that was just going to give me the skills to move on with. And I think that's probably a very old-fashioned view. It was something that I learnt probably from my grandfather. He was so committed to the military. But ultimately, my family was going to be the most important thing for me. And I don't have any regrets about that. I made the right choice. I just wish sometimes that things were a little bit easier. I probably missed out on the pointy end of the stick, definitely. There were a couple of girls I know that wanted to go into some arms corps. The closest they got was being engineers, and some of those, it didn't work out so well. There was a general non-acceptance of women in those roles. But I personally didn't have that, because logistics was one of those things that logistics was largely seen as something that women could very easily be integrated into. If you're going to start doing some kind of transition, they're the obvious ones that you start with. It's funny, I still think there's a lot of grappling going on in the services about women, but we try just as hard as the blokes do. The happy days for me were probably in my young officer days, when you didn't have to fly a desk all the time, when you were out in the field, or you're out in a convoy of trucks. I remember I learnt how to drive a Mack truck, and I learnt how to drive a Unimog, and I'd never driven a manual car before I did those things. So it was just an effort to get into the Mack truck. Couldn't see over the bonnet. But that's probably more about my physical stature.
Did you have a pillow or a cushion?
A pillow or a cushion. I can't remember. I think I just sat right forward on the chair and ended up with massively sore shoulders. But I remember the controls being very heavy. So put it this way, it was not, that was just knowing you trained as a transport officer, you got that training, just I think to give you an idea of what the troops were going to be doing. I marched as as when I was in the military. I did Anzac Day parades and whatnot, but I tend not to now. I find I'll just do quiet reflection. I watch the march, the Sydney March. I don't do the dawn service. I just feel I would rather reflect quietly on it. And yeah, that's just how I feel. I don't think I've been to the battlefields, the Somme. Haven't been to Gallipoli. If ever there was a sobering reminder of the futility of war, you only have to go to Western France and you see it laid out there in all its stark reality. But I think it is important that we remember those feats, that sacrifice. But I prefer to do it in a more quiet way. The infantry centre was an eye opener for me, because I remember I was tasked with doing some parade announcements when we had the anniversary of a battle, and because the infantry centre had so many people passing through there from different units, so it was quite a regular thing. So they'd have a big parade, and then I'd be there. I'd be, I guess, a bit like the MC, or reading about a battle. And I had no real concept of the Vietnam War other than watching it on the television, of course. I remember, watching the bombings and things, the carpet bombings by the US and whatnot, but not fully understanding what it was to be a soldier in those times. So the infantry centre was fantastic because it really gave me, I got to meet those crusty old blokes that had had a terrible time, but you know what, they just went about their business, so it was, infantry centre was a real eye opener for me. I'd get to learn then about some of the battles. As I said earlier, my grandfather used to romanticise about his time. I'm sure it was probably pretty bad in Burma. And then my other grandfather was, he was an anti-aircraft gunner on the cliffs of Dover. So I guess I've had that exposure to veterans throughout my life. Parachute training. So there were two bits to this. To be a parachute rigger and pack someone's parachute, you had to be willing to jump from a plane. So me thinking that this was a great idea, when I was on my initial employment training as a clerk, that's when they were canvassing for people to do this. So I thought, yeah, I'm going to put my hand up. But it took a long time to get there. But so I had to do, in the lead up to the parachute rigging, you had to qualify on a basic parachute training course, which was static line, so no free falling. So I thought, yeah, I'm going to give that a go. So a lot of PT, running around as a SALT. I was posted to Campbell Park to this psych unit, and fortunately we had Duntroon and we had Mount Ainslie, so running around there training for this basic parachute course. So when I got there, I'd be able to be, ready for it. Anyway, I thought there was another girl that was going to do this course with me, and she wasn't able to. And so I ended up only being the only girl on this parachute course. And it was like, oh, what have I done? Most of the fellows that were there were from Delta Company and 6RAR, and they were 6RAR were about to go airborne at that point. They were, I think it's changed now, but I think at that point there was some idea that they would be, Delta Company were going to be the parachute company. So there were a whole bunch of infantry soldiers on the course, and there were a whole bunch of SAS trainees or cadre, so all the support people for SAS. They were also on there. So I'm thinking, how did I find myself here? Anyway, so parachute training was very physically demanding. It was frightening. I'm actually afraid of heights. The parachuting bit wasn't the bit that I was most frightened of. Is you do training exercises out of towers. There was a thing called a Polish tower and the exit tower, if I recall, and it was so you could see the ground. It was very you were aware of how high you were, whereas when you're in a plane, you're high, but you just lose all sense of, well, I did, reality. So anyway, it was frightening. That side of it was frightening, physically demanding. And then, so when we started doing our actual jumping out of the aircraft, it was out of a Chinook helicopter. So I think there were about 44 of us. And so I think it was a few weeks into the course, it was our first jump. And of course, I was the only girl on the course, so I was pretty much up the front of every stick that went out of the aircraft, because what bloke was not going to go out after a female had gone out, after a girl had gone out of the aircraft. So it was hugely noisy. I remember the Chinook was hugely noisy and bumpy, and we did this up at Saltash in just north of Newcastle at the RAF base Williamtown. And so I remember standing on the ramp of that Chinook just thinking, what am I doing? And then you just, and then you do this shuffle step down towards the edge of the ramp, and then you see the green light, and then you just get tapped on the shoulder, and you just don't hesitate. You just go, because if you don't, you're going to have, 40 other people coming over the top of you. So I just jumped, and it was an amazing feeling. So I did 4 jumps out of the Chinook. The 5th jump was out of a Hercules, and that was out of the side of the Hercules, and that was supposed to be my qualifying jump, and that time I had to jump it was full equipment, so that meant a pack, a rifle, and the way you're sort of rigged up, where your pack is, etc. For me, being short, was very hard to walk to get. I almost had to be lifted onto the lip of the the back of the Herc to get on. It was so heavy, and I just shuffled into my spot. And I went out of the aircraft. We all, went up, and I went out of the aircraft. And so I qualified. And then the following jump, it was windy. It was a bit touch and go whether we'd go, and it was decided, we're good to go, and I got blown slightly off course and landed slightly off the drop zone, but it was enough to. The ground was very uneven, and I broke my leg in 3 spots, and that was the end of my glorious parachuting days. So it was a very physically demanding course, so I have to say. And it actually told me the limitations of being small and having all of this equipment on, which is exactly what you'd have if you were jumping into battle. You'd have all of these things, your pack, possibly a radio, depending on what your job was, what your role was, and a rifle. And it was always going to be hard for me to consistently do that. I think it was, it was fine while I was on training, but in reality it probably would have been difficult. I felt like I achieved something. Put it this way, I got to wear a set of wings on my arm for the next little while, and until I, couldn't requalify, but I got to wear those parachute wings, which I have to say raised a few eyebrows. It was highly unusual to see a woman in those days with a set of wings. But it got the blokes talking, and it was, despite the bad accident, it was fun.
Sounds like.
Yeah.
How did you get the chute open with the rifle?
I know it was so static line.
Oh, okay.
It's hooked up to the actual parachute. So when you come out, the minute you come out of the aircraft, it's on like a bungee strap. It's on like a what I call a big elastic band. So, and then it breaks the. I guess there must be a toggle or something on the parachute. I can't remember, to be honest. And it breaks that. The static line stays in the aircraft, and it deploys your chute. But you're far enough away from the aircraft for it to actually deploy. So, and they were not very. That was the other thing, probably why I didn't. I was trying to steer like mad to get, because I could see I was going to come off the drop zone. I was steering this thing like mad to try and get onto the drop zone, but it. The more you steer, the more you're robbing your canopy of air, and so you go faster. And I knew I was going to, like, when I let go, not steer, because to try and sort of get a bit more air into the chute, it was like, it's too late now. Just remember your drills, because that's all drilled into you, how to, bend the knees so you're not landing on straight legs. All of those sort of things kick in, but I knew I was going too fast, and it was too windy. It was way too windy. So I hit trees, a few low sort of trees, bushes and whatnot. Managing as somebody who'd not managed people before, it was enough as a starting point.
And you didn't get any resistance as a female officer?
I had some resistance from some of the senior NCOs, but generally once they got to know me, it was fine. They were respectful. Once they knew I wasn't there as some social experiment, they were fine. I did my job. They respected me. I think I think they liked me by and large, although it wasn't my job to be liked, but they liked me, and they trusted me, and I trusted them. So it's a mutual relationship with soldiers, and most of them would go above and beyond if they were asked. So, but yes, there was a little bit of resistance. Some of the fellas had some pretty rough times in Vietnam or whatever, or maybe not even Vietnam. Maybe they were just they just had some difficulties accepting that, and I 100% understand that. It was all, I guess it was a bit of an experiment. Still, when I said earlier that we trialled some camouflage uniforms. We were the first. I remember we were given these uniforms to trial, and then lo and behold, at the end of the course, we gave them back. At the end of cadet training, we gave them back. Lo and behold, they were rolled out. The one that we said was the most comfortable or whatever, they ended up being pretty much rolled out. So before that, it was starched greens, the full dark green, uniforms, drill uniforms in jungle, like what you would have seen with Vietnam veterans. That was pretty much what we were wearing when we started, but by the end of it, we were in camouflage equipment. So we loved those because we didn't have to iron them. Army Maritime School was fantastic. I had my first officer commanding there. His name was Jack Peel, and he was, I believe he was in small ships in Vietnam. So he was such a character, and so there was Jack, Captain Jack as we used to call him, and Jack moved on not long after a little while after I was there. The school is actually located in Chowder Bay in Sydney on Middlehead. So my office looked straight out onto the harbour. So when the bicentennial was on in 1988, when I was there, I had front row seats pretty much. So that's the lighter side of it. But it was a very interesting place because you'd see all sorts of people come through there. It was where we used to have the landing craft there that you see now. I think it was the AB 1066, the old landing craft, LCH. And we had the Larks that used to go to Antarctica, the amphibious vessels. So it was a really interesting place. There were lots of things going on there. And the other thing that was really one of the highlights there was they did the Australian launch for Good Morning Vietnam at Army Maritime School. One of the senior NCOs there, he was the RQMS, Jimmy. He had one arm. He had suffered terrible injuries in Vietnam, and he had a prosthetic, and he was pretty, beaten up, and he was a lovely bloke, and so they used Robin Williams from Good Morning Vietnam for the Australian premiere was brought across from the Opera House to the school, and that's where they did the launch of Good Morning Vietnam in Australia. And so got to meet this, Robin Williams as he's coming around. He was so funny. It was just one of those things that you just think, oh, I'm in the army, what am I doing here? There's a Hollywood guy just there. That was crazy stuff. But I think about those characters, like, you know, Jimmy, that was like so beaten up from Vietnam, and then we had all sorts there. People who'd been to Antarctica, who did the rotations. You know, we did the training there for anybody who went to Antarctica from the army. I mean, so it was it was just a fabulous posting, and I was the administration officer there.